Imagine trying to fall asleep while your bed lurches, creaks, and crashes beneath you. For sailors of the high seas, rest came not in peace, but in chaos, with waves pounding above their heads, rats scurrying below, and hammocks swinging like pendulums. Sleep during a storm wasn't just difficult, was almost impossible. And yet, they had no choice but to close their eyes and hope the ship didn't split in two. So tuck in tight and drift back to the roaring 1700s. Subscribe for more bedtime voyages through history, and don't forget to ring the bell icon so you never miss a midnight tale from the past. Ever tried to nap during a thunderstorm? Now imagine doing it at sea. You find yourself standing on the gun deck of HMS Shrewsbury in November of 1703, watching as the evening watch begins the methodical ritual that has defined naval life for over a century. The space around you hums with the quiet efficiency of men who have performed these same movements thousands of times before. Each sailor knows precisely where his hammock belongs. Each understands the exact sequence of knots and hitches required to secure their sleeping sling between the massive oak beams that form the ship's skeleton. The Royal Navy had formally adopted the hammock system in 1597, more than 100 years before this particular November evening. And by 1703, the practice had been refined into a science of space management that would have impressed any modern efficiency expert. Each man was allocated precisely 28 inches of lateral space for his hammock, a measurement that had been calculated to provide maximum accommodation for the ship's complement, while ensuring that no sailor would interfere with his neighbors. Rest. This mathematical precision was not merely a matter of comfort, it was a requirement of survival. The hammocks themselves were marvels of naval engineering, though they appeared deceptively simple. Each consisted of a canvas sling that, when suspended, formed a receptacle for a mattress and blanket. The canvas was not flat like the hammocks you might encounter in a modern garden, but designed to wrap around the sailor in what contemporary observers described as a cocoon-like embrace. This enveloping design served a crucial purpose during rough weather, preventing the occupant from being thrown out when the ship rolled or pitched violently. The bedding itself was the sailor's personal property, purchased through deductions from his pay according to regulations that were meticulously recorded in the ship's muster books. Each sailor in his first year of service was allotted 1 mattress and 2 blankets, items that could be separated from the hammock for washing, and would accompany him from ship to ship throughout his naval career. The mattress was typically stuffed with straw or horsehair, materials that provided some cushioning while remaining relatively impervious to the dampness that pervaded every corner of a wooden ship. The sleeping arrangements were strictly hierarchical, with locations assigned according to rank. The master-at-arms or another senior petty officer would assign each sailor a specific number indicating where his hammock should be hung during the designated sleeping hours. Higher-ranking sailors received the more desirable positions, typically those closer to the center of the ship where the motion was less severe, and further from the areas where water was most likely to penetrate during storms. The daily routine of hammock management was as regimented as every other aspect of naval life. At sunrise, when the ship's bell announced the end of the night watches, sailors would show a leg literally extend a foot from their hammock to demonstrate they were awake and ready to rise. The hammocks were then quickly taken down, the bedding placed inside, and the entire bundle lashed with precise knots, before being carried topside and stowed in the nettings along the ship's bulwarks. This process served multiple purposes. It cleared the gun deck for daily activities, provided additional protection against enemy fire during battle, and ensured that the bedding would be aired and dried by the sun and wind. During clear weather, this system functioned with clockwork precision. The hammocks spent their days in the fresh air and sunshine, helping to prevent the accumulation of moisture and the growth of mold that could quickly render bedding unusable. The gun deck, freed from the presence of hundreds of suspended hammocks, could be properly cleaned and maintained. The deck below the hammocks was scrubbed frequently, and the systematic laundering of clothing limited the effects of lice, mold, and mildew. But you are witnessing this routine in November of 1703, during what would become known as the most destructive storm in British maritime history. The normal patterns of naval life are about to be shattered by winds that contemporary accounts suggest exceeded anything previously recorded. The methodical world of hammock stowage and watch rotations is about to be replaced by something far more primitive, the basic human struggle for survival. As evening approaches on what will be remembered as November 26, 1703, the barometric pressure has been dropping steadily for hours, though the sailors lack the instruments to measure this phenomenon. What they can observe are the traditional signs that their forebears have learned to read over centuries of maritime experience: the particular quality of light on the horizon, the behavior of seabirds, the feel of the wind as it begins to shift and strengthen. The older hands among the crew exchange meaningful glances, recognizing portents that the younger sailors have not yet learned to interpret. The ship's routine continues, but with an undercurrent of tension that experienced mariners can feel in their bones. The hammocks are rigged as usual, but tonight there is an unspoken understanding that normal sleep will be impossible. The canvas cocoons that have provided comfort and security for generations of sailors are about to face their ultimate test. And many of the men preparing for rest know they may not survive to see another sunrise. The transformation from ordered naval routine to desperate survival began gradually. Then suddenly, as storms often do, you observe the first signs as the evening watch takes its stations on November 26, 1703. The wind, which had been steady from the southwest all day, begins to veer and strengthen, with an ominous consistency that sets the older hands to checking lashings and securing loose items with unusual care. The ship's motion, always present, but typically rhythmic and predictable, takes on a different character, sharper, more violent, with an underlying tremor that suggests forces far beyond normal weather patterns. HMS Shrewsbury, like the other ships of the Channel Squadron, had been at anchor in the Downs, that supposedly secure anchorage between the Goodwin Sands and the Kent coast that had sheltered English fleets for centuries. The Downs had always been considered a safe haven, protected from the worst Atlantic swells by the barrier of the sands themselves. On this night, that sense of security would prove catastrophic. As darkness falls, the wind continues to strengthen. Beyond anything in the collective memory of the fleet, the ship begins to drag her anchors. Despite the massive weight of iron designed to hold even a first-rate ship of the line in the heaviest seas. Miles Knobcliffe, writing from aboard HMS Shrewsbury, would later recall that he had not had his clothes off, nor slept a wink for 4 nights, and had nearly died from cold. His testimony provides a window into the complete abandonment of normal sleeping arrangements that characterized this unprecedented storm. The hammocks, so carefully rigged according to regulations and tradition, become not places of rest, but instruments of torture as the ship begins to pitch and roll with extraordinary violence. Men who attempt to remain in their canvas slings find themselves thrown against the overhead beams with bone-crushing force, or catapulted from their hammocks entirely as the ship lurches in ways that defy the normal physics of maritime motion. The 28 inches of space allocated to each man, so precisely calculated for normal conditions, becomes meaningless when the ship is rolling 40 or 50 degrees to each side. The normal watch system, which divided the crew into shifts allowing each group approximately 4 hours of rest at a time, collapses entirely as all hands are called to manage the crisis. The familiar rhythm of naval life for hours on watch, 4 hours, oft disappears as quickly as the storm surge overwhelms the carefully planned anchorage. Every man capable of working is needed continuously as the ship fights for her life against forces that seem determined to destroy her. The gun deck, normally cleared of hammocks during daylight hours, becomes a chaotic maze of fallen canvas and bedding as sailors abandon any pretense of maintaining their sleeping arrangements. The hammocks, designed to be quickly stowed in the bulwark nettings, cannot be moved topside because the deck is continuously swept by enormous waves that would wash any man overboard in seconds. Instead, the canvas slings hang limp and useless, swinging wildly with each roll of the ship, striking anyone who ventures too close with enough force to cause serious injury in cramped conditions. Some sailors had learned to sling their hammocks under the clews of the regular hammocks, creating a makeshift second tier of sleeping arrangements. During the great storm, this adaptation becomes a source of additional danger as the secondary hammocks, less securely fastened, break loose from their moorings and swing like pendulums through the crowded gun deck, creating new hazards for men already struggling to maintain their footing on the heaving deck. The physical environment below decks deteriorates rapidly as the storm intensifies. The gun ports, normally sealed against ordinary weather, begin to leak as the sea pounds against the ship's hull with unprecedented force. The air below decks becomes increasingly stale and difficult to breathe, a condition that in normal circumstances would be alleviated by briefly opening the gun ports or using canvas funnels to direct fresh air below. During the storm, such measures become impossible, and men begin to experience the headaches and disorientation that come from mild carbon dioxide poisoning. The cannon, massive iron weapons that in battle provide the ship's offensive power, become deadly hazards as they strain against their lashings. Each gun weighs several tons, and if freed from its restraints by the ship's violent motion, becomes a loose cannon in the most literal sense, an unstoppable force that can crush men and smash through the ship's hull. Sailors abandon their hammocks not to sleep elsewhere, but to help secure these enormous weapons before they can break free and destroy the ship from within. Fresh water, normally rationed but generally available, becomes contaminated as seawater finds its way into the ship's stores. The bread, already hard and often infested with weevils under the best circumstances, becomes inedible as it absorbs salt water and begins to dissolve into an inedible paste. Men who have not slept for days find themselves working on empty stomachs, their physical reserves depleted at the very moment when their survival depends on maximum exertion. As the night wears on, the distinction between the interior and exterior of the ship begins to blur. Water pours through every seam and opening, and the gun deck becomes a surreal landscape where sailors wade through knee-deep seawater while overhead the hammock fittings creak and groan under stresses they were never designed to withstand. The concept of dry bedding becomes meaningless, and the idea of sleep transforms from a physical necessity to an impossible luxury that belongs to a world that no longer exists. By the third day of the great storm of 1703, the concept of sleep had been completely redefined aboard the ships of the Channel Squadron. You witness the gradual deterioration of men who have been pushed beyond the normal limits of human endurance, their bodies and minds functioning on reserves that draw from the deepest wells of survival instinct. The careful routines that had governed naval life for generations have been replaced by something more primitive: the basic struggle to remain alive until the storm passes. Miles Knobcliffe's testimony from HMS Shrewsbury provides the most detailed, contemporary account of what this experience meant for individual sailors. His statement that he had not had his clothes off, nor slept a wink for 4 nights, reveals the complete abandonment of normal human rhythms that the storm demanded. This was not merely a matter of staying on duty during an emergency, it was a fundamental transformation of existence where the basic functions of rest and recovery became impossible luxuries. The physical effects of prolonged sleep deprivation begin to manifest themselves in ways that compound the already desperate situation. Men who have not slept for 72 hours or more begin to experience hallucinations and disorientation. symptoms that in normal circumstances would disqualify them from duty, but which during the storm must be endured while continuing to perform complex and dangerous tasks. The rope work required to secure a ship in heavy weather demands precise coordination and clear thinking. Yet the sailors attempting these tasks are operating in states of consciousness that border on delirium. The strategy employed by HMS Shrewsbury and other surviving ships involved deploying their largest anchors when smaller ones failed to hold. This required teams of exhausted men to manhandle massive chains and anchor cables under conditions where a single mistake could be fatal. The physical strength required for such work would be demanding for well-rested men. For sailors who had not slept in days, it represented a superhuman effort that could only be sustained through collective determination and the knowledge that failure meant death for everyone aboard. The psychological dimension of sleepless survival during the storm created its own particular form of suffering. Without the restorative power of sleep, the mind loses its ability to process trauma and stress effectively. Each new crisis, the failure of an anchor, the flooding of a compartment, the loss of a shipmate accumulates without the natural healing that sleep normally provides. Men begin to operate in a state of accumulated shock, their responses becoming increasingly automatic and instinctive as higher-order thinking becomes impossible. The prayer mentioned in contemporary accounts takes on a significance that extends beyond mere religious observance. For men pushed to the absolute limits of physical and mental endurance, collective prayer serves multiple functions. It provides a momentary pause from physical labor, creates a sense of shared purpose that transcends individual desperation, and offers a psychological anchor when all other certainties have been swept away by the storm. The loss of normal sleep patterns affects every aspect of shipboard life. The careful watches that normally ensured fresh men were always available for emergency work become meaningless when every man must work continuously. The hot food that would normally sustain heavy labor becomes impossible to prepare as the ship's galley fires are extinguished by flooding. Men subsist on cold, saltwater contaminated provisions, their physical reserves depleting at precisely the moment when their survival depends on maximum exertion. The hammock system, so carefully designed to provide comfort and security during normal sailing conditions, reveals its limitations under extreme stress. The canvas slings that normally protected sailors from being thrown from their beds become traps that can strangle or crush their occupants. When the ship's motion exceeds all previous experience, men abandon their personal sleeping spaces, not by choice, but because remaining in them has become more dangerous than finding shelter elsewhere in the ship. Perhaps most significantly, the storm demonstrates the fundamental vulnerability of human beings to forces beyond their control or understanding. The loss of 1/3 of all Royal Navy seamen in a single night represents not just a military disaster, but a human catastrophe that touches every aspect of British maritime culture. The men who died were not merely statistics, but individuals who had mastered the complex skills of seamanship, who had developed personal relationships with their shipmates, and who had created lives within the confined but ordered world of naval service. The survivors, like Miles Knobcliffe, carry with them the memory of what human endurance can achieve when pushed to absolute limits. Their testimony preserves not just the facts of the storm, but the profound transformation that occurs when normal human needs sleep, food, warmth, security become impossible to satisfy. The Great Storm of 1703 becomes a benchmark against which all future hardships will be measured. A reminder that the relationship between human beings and the natural world remains fundamentally unequal despite all advances in technology and seamanship. For those who live through this experience, sleep would never again be taken for granted. The simple act of lying down in a secure hammock, closing one's eyes, and surrendering consciousness to natural rest would forever carry the memory of nights when such surrender meant death. The storm passes, but its lessons about human fragility and resilience become part of naval culture for generations to come. You find yourself aboard USS Constitution in the summer of 1854. Observing the systematic differences that distinguish American naval sleeping arrangements from their British counterparts. The young United States Navy, barely 8 decades old, has developed its own approach to the ancient problem of providing rest for sailors in dangerous waters. While the basic challenges remain the same, how to sleep securely in a vessel that never stops. Moving the American solutions reflect both practical innovation and the democratic ideals that shaped the new nation. The official regulations of 1818 specify that enlisted personnel, including petty officers, sleep in canvas hammocks slung on the berth deck, following the time-tested system pioneered by earlier naval powers. However, American naval architecture has introduced subtle modifications that reflect both improved understanding of maritime medicine and the practical lessons learned from decades of service in varied climates. The berth deck arrangement provides better ventilation than the gun deck sleeping of earlier eras, recognizing that fresh air circulation becomes crucial during extended voyages in tropical waters. The democratization of naval service in America creates sleeping arrangements that differ significantly from the rigid hierarchy of European navies, while rank still determines the quality of accommodation officers. Occupy cabins or berth deck apartments assigned according to rank the American system provides enlisted sailors with more standardized and humane conditions than their counterparts in other services. Each man receives the same basic allotment of bedding and hammock space. Regardless of birth or social background, the Pacific stations where American naval power is expanding in the 1850s present unique challenges for maintaining healthy sleep patterns. Unlike the Atlantic, where weather patterns follow relatively predictable seasonal cycles, the Pacific confronts sailors with typhoons that can develop with stunning rapidity and achieve intensities unknown in other ocean basins. The combination of vast distances, limited weather reporting, and the sheer power of Pacific storms creates conditions where normal sleep becomes not just difficult, but potentially deadly. The watch system aboard American ships has evolved to address both democratic principles and practical necessities. The traditional division of 24 hours into watches continues, but American naval regulations place greater emphasis on ensuring that all hands receive adequate rest during normal conditions. This attention to sailor welfare reflects both humanitarian concerns and the practical recognition that exhausted crews perform poorly when emergencies arise. The hammock itself remains the foundation of naval sleeping arrangements, but American naval construction incorporates improvements learned from decades of service in varied climates. The berth deck provides better protection from weather than the gun deck arrangements still used by some navies, while improved ventilation systems help address the problem of stale air that had plagued earlier ship designs. When hammocks cannot be taken on deck due to weather conditions, they are stowed below in specially designed nettings that protect bedding from moisture while maintaining air circulation. The expansion of American commerce and naval power into the Pacific during this period creates new pressures on traditional sleeping arrangements. Voyages that in the Atlantic might last weeks extend 2 months in the vast Pacific, placing unprecedented stress on both equipment and human endurance. The hammocks and bedding that serve adequately for coastal patrols must now survive the humidity of tropical waters, the extreme cold of northern Pacific routes, and the violent motion of storms that exceed anything experienced in more familiar waters. American naval medicine has begun to recognize the connection between adequate sleep and crew health in ways that influence ship design and routine. The chronic diseases that had decimated earlier crew scurvy, dysentery, typhus are increasingly understood to be connected to living conditions that include sleeping arrangements. This growing awareness leads to modifications in ventilation, spacing, and hygiene that represent genuine improvements over traditional practices. Even as they maintain the basic hammock system that has served navies for centuries, the cultural mixing that characterizes American cruise native-born Americans, naturalized immigrants, men from dozens of different maritime traditions, creates sleeping quarters where different approaches to rest and survival are constantly exchanged. Sailors bring techniques learned in merchant service, whaling ships, and foreign navies, creating a practical laboratory for testing different approaches to the eternal problem of sleeping securely at sea. The specific dangers posed by Pacific typhoons require adaptations that go beyond traditional storm preparations. These massive rotating storms can maintain their power over vast ocean distances, creating conditions where ships may face severe weather for days or weeks at a time. The conventional wisdom that storms blow themselves out within 24 to 48 hours proves inadequate in the face of typhoons that can maintain hurricane-force winds for extended periods while covering thousands of square miles of ocean. As you observe the evening routine aboard USS Constitution during her Pacific deployment, you witnessed an American naval culture that has absorbed centuries of maritime experience while adapting it to the specific challenges of democratic service and in Pacific navigation. The hammocks swing in their eternal rhythm, the watches change with mechanical precision, and the crew settles into sleep with the confidence born of training and tradition. What they cannot know, as they surrender consciousness to natural rest, is that the Pacific is preparing to teach them lessons about quount. ATSA, only Ruby Kiss, has the luxurious texture. Batch quount. So, my lie last quound a. It lows a wall last quound. What we see to wound cowed off seas. We see out to wound quound off seas. My lie sub side, my lied quound. It's quow si quoud, it's quoud. Why we see with the relad, prismide, my ad, quite a wide. It is relied, it is it, we saw tacit it and to see it sit to set sup asa a sick it as it lets sick it to the it that the kit it sits it bake it is this deputy we sit good sit content as to survival that no amount of tradition can anticipate. The morning of September 21st, 1854, begins with the kind of weather that experienced Pacific sailors learned to regard with particular suspicion. You observe from the deck of a merchant vessel approximately 200 miles south of the Formosa, straight as the barometric signs that presage a major typhoon begin to manifest themselves across the vast expanse of the South China Sea. The wind, which had been steady from the east-southeast throughout the night, begins to show the first signs of the rotational pattern that distinguishes typhoons from ordinary storms. USS Porpoise, a 224-ton brig assigned to the East India Squadron, has been conducting routine patrol operations in these waters for 6 months. The vessel and her crew of 62 men would disappear entirely during the typhoon that develops over the next 72 hours, leaving no survivors and no wreckage to tell the story of their final hours. What we can reconstruct comes from the experiences of other vessels that encountered similar conditions and lived to describe them, combined with our understanding of how American naval sleep and rest patterns would have been affected by such a catastrophe. The typhoon that claims USS Porpoise represents the kind of meteorological event that the Pacific generates with terrifying regularity. Unlike Atlantic storms, which typically develop along predictable paths and maintain their power for limited periods, Pacific typhoons can sustain hurricane-force winds for days, while following erratic courses that make avoidance nearly impossible. The vast distances of the Pacific mean that ships can find themselves hundreds of miles from any shelter when these storms develop. with no option but to ride out conditions that exceed the design limitations of 19th century naval vessels. As the storm intensifies during the evening hours of September 21st, the crew of USS Porpoise faces the same challenge that confronts all sailing vessels in extreme weather: the complete breakdown of normal routines and the transition to survival mode. The watch system that normally provides each sailor with regular periods of rest collapses as all hands are required to work continuously to maintain the ship's integrity, against forces that seem determined to tear her apart. The hammocks that had provided secure rest during normal sailing conditions become liabilities as the ship begins to pitch and roll with unprecedented violence. American naval regulations require that hammocks be taken down and stowed during rough weather, but the intensity of the typhoon makes even this basic precaution impossible to implement safely. Men attempting to move about the berth deck find themselves thrown against bulkheads and equipment with bone-crushing force, while overhead, the massive beams that normally support the hammock system creak and groan under stresses they were never designed to withstand. The physical environment below decks deteriorates with frightening rapidity as seawater begins to penetrate every opening in the ship's hull. The berth deck, normally kept dry and reasonably comfortable, becomes a flooded hell where sailors struggle to maintain their footing while fighting to keep the ship afloat. The improved ventilation that distinguishes American naval architecture becomes a liability as gun ports and air channels that normally provide fresh air instead emit torrents of seawater that threaten to swamp the vessel entirely. The democratic ideals that shape American naval service prove inadequate in the face of natural forces that recognize no human political arrangements. Officers and enlisted men work side by side in conditions where traditional hierarchies become meaningless, but their combined efforts cannot overcome the fundamental physics of a small wooden vessel confronting winds that exceed 150 miles per hour and waves that tower 60 feet above the normal sea level. Sleep deprivation compounds every other challenge as the storm continues into its second and third days. Men who have not rested for 48 hours or more begin to make the kinds of errors that in normal circumstances would be merely embarrassing, but which during a typhoon can prove fatal. The complex coordination required to work a sailing ship in heavy weather demands clear thinking and precise timing. Yet the crew of USS Porpoise must perform these tasks while operating in states of consciousness that border on hallucination. The loss of normal sleep patterns affects not just individual performance, but the collective ability of the crew to function as an integrated unit. The watch system that normally ensures fresh men are always available for critical tasks breaks down entirely when every man must work continuously. The hot food that would normally sustain heavy labor becomes impossible to prepare as the ship's galley is repeatedly flooded. Men subsist on whatever cold provisions they can find while expending enormous physical energy in their fight for survival. As the typhoon reaches its maximum intensity during the night of September 23rd, USS Porpoise confronts forces that exceed the survival capability of any 19th century vessel. The combination of extreme winds, mountainous seas, and the vessel's own limitations creates a situation where human skill and determination, no matter how courageously applied, cannot overcome the basic physics of the situation. The ship and her crew vanish into the storm without leaving any trace of their final moments, becoming one of the many vessels that simply disappear in the vast spaces of the Pacific Ocean. The loss of USS Porpoise represents more than just a military disaster. It demonstrates the fundamental vulnerability of human beings to natural forces that operate on scales beyond human comprehension. The 62 men who died were not casualties of human conflict, but victims of the eternal struggle between human ambition and natural power. A reminder that despite all advances in seamanship and technology, the ocean remains an environment where human survival depends ultimately on forces beyond human control. The disappearance of USS Porpoise, in September 1854, sends shockwaves through the small but growing American naval establishment, forcing a fundamental reconsideration of how American ships and crews can survive in the dangerous waters of the Pacific. You observe the gradual evolution of naval thinking as reports filter back to Washington, describing not just this single disaster, but a pattern of losses that suggests American naval expansion has outpaced the service's understanding of Pacific conditions. The loss of at least 62 sailors in a single storm represents a significant percentage of American naval strength in Pacific waters. But more importantly, it demonstrates the inadequacy of traditional Atlantic-based naval practices when applied to the fundamentally different conditions of the world's largest ocean. The lessons learned from this disaster and others like it begin to reshape American naval architecture, training, and operational procedures in ways that will influence naval development for decades to come. The investigation into the loss of USS Porpoise, conducted primarily through interviews with survivors of similar storms and analysis of vessels that managed to survive comparable conditions, reveals systematic problems with existing approaches to Pacific navigation. The traditional weather wisdom that served Atlantic sailors adequately proves insufficient for predicting the behavior of Pacific typhoons, which can develop with stunning rapidity and maintain their power over vast distances that dwarf the scale of Atlantic storms. Sleep deprivation emerges as a critical factor in storm survival, leading to the first systematic American naval study of how exhaustion affects crew performance during emergencies. Officers who have survived typhoon encounters report that the collapse of normal rest patterns creates a cascade of problems that extends far beyond simple fatigue. Men who have not slept for days begin to make increasingly dangerous errors in judgment, while the physical weakness that results from prolonged exhaustion reduces their ability to perform the heavy manual labor required to save a ship in distress. The hammock system, so central to naval sleeping arrangements for centuries, undergoes significant modification based on Pacific experience. American naval architects begin to experiment with alternative berth arrangements that provide greater security during extreme weather while maintaining the space efficiency that makes hammocks practical for ships with large crews. These experiments, driven by the practical necessity of keeping men alive during typhoons, lead to innovations that will eventually influence naval architecture worldwide. The development of improved weather prediction methods becomes a priority for the American Navy as officers recognize that avoiding severe storms is far more practical than trying to survive them. The traditional weather lore that had served sailors for generations of wind patterns, cloud formations, and animal behavior proves insufficient for Pacific conditions, leading to the first systematic attempts to develop scientific approaches to maritime weather forecasting. The human cost of Pacific expansion extends beyond the immediate casualties of individual storms to encompass the long-term effects of chronic sleep deprivation on sailors serving extended deployments in dangerous waters. Medical officers begin to document patterns of illness and psychological distress that appear connected to the prolonged stress of serving in waters where normal rest becomes impossible for weeks at a time. These observations lead to modifications in deployment schedules and crew rotation policies that recognize the limits of human endurance. The loss of USS Porpoise also highlights the isolation that characterizes Pacific naval service during this period. Unlike Atlantic operations, where ships rarely travel more than a few days from friendly ports, Pacific deployments require vessels to operate independently for months at a time in waters where rescue is impossible and communication with higher authority is sporadic at best. This isolation places enormous psychological pressure on crews already stressed by dangerous conditions and inadequate rest. The expansion of American commercial interests in the Pacific, driven by the California Gold Rush and the opening of trade with Asia, creates pressure for naval protection that exceeds the service's ability to provide safe and effective coverage. The result is a period of dangerous experimentation where ships and crews are pushed beyond their proven capabilities, leading to disasters like the loss of USS Porpoise that serve as expensive lessons in the limits of human adaptation to hostile environments. The eventual development of steam power offers partial solutions to some Pacific navigation problems, allowing ships to maintain headway against storms and reducing their vulnerability to being driven onto dangerous coasts. However, early steam vessels create new problems for sleeping arrangements as the heat and noise of mechanical propulsion make traditional berth areas uninhabitable, forcing further innovations in crew accommodation. The psychological impact of serving in waters where entire ships can disappear without trace begins to affect recruitment and retention in the expanding American Navy. The glamour of Pacific service, initially attractive to sailors seeking adventure and rapid promotion, diminishes as stories of missing vessels and exhausted crews filter back to American ports. This leads to the first systematic efforts to improve living conditions aboard naval vessels. Recognizing that crew welfare is essential for maintaining an effective fighting force. Perhaps most significantly, the lessons learned from Pacific typhoons begin to influence American naval strategy in ways that extend far beyond questions of individual survival. The recognition that traditional European naval practices prove inadequate in crackling conditions leads to the development of distinctly American approaches to naval architecture, crew training, and operational planning that will eventually make the United States Navy the world's dominant Pacific force. You find yourself in the cramped quarters of a Liverpool-bound merchant vessel in 1847. Observing how commercial maritime operations approach the eternal problem of providing adequate rest for crews, whose livelihoods depend on moving cargo safely across dangerous waters. Unlike naval vessels, where sleeping arrangements are regulated by official doctrine and military necessity, merchant ships operate under the more flexible, but often harsher, constraints of commercial efficiency and profit maximization. The merchant marine represents a different world from the regimented life of naval service, one where sleeping arrangements reflect the practical compromises between human needs and economic reality. Merchant ships moved away from hammocks during the 19th century, with crews sleeping in bunkrooms, mostly in the forecastle, while officers occupied cabins. This transition reflects both the reduced space constraints on commercial vessels, which do not need to clear sleeping areas for cannon placement, and the recognition that permanent bunks provide greater comfort during the long voyages that characterize merchant service. The forecastle, universally known as the forecastle to generations of merchant sailors, becomes the center of crew life in ways that have no equivalent in naval service. Unlike the strictly regulated gun decks of warships, the forecastle develops its own culture and customs, shaped by the diverse backgrounds of merchant crews and the practical necessities of commercial maritime life. Men from different nations, speaking various languages and following different customs, must learn to share sleeping space in ways that minimize conflict while maximizing the limited comfort available aboard working vessels. The bunk system adopted by merchant vessels represents a significant departure from centuries of naval tradition, but one driven by compelling practical advantages. Individual bunks built into the ship's structure, rather than suspended like hammocks, provide greater security during rough weather while offering storage space for the personal possessions that merchant sailors, unlike their naval counterparts, are permitted to accumulate during their travels. Each bunk becomes a private domain where men can retreat from the collective life of the ship, a luxury unknown in the regulated sleeping arrangements of military vessels. The commercial pressures that drive merchant shipping create sleeping schedules that differ significantly from the watch system of naval vessels, where warships operate with carefully planned crew rotations designed to maintain maximum effectiveness during potential combat. Merchant ships function with minimal crews working maximum hours to reduce labor costs and increase profit margins. Sleep becomes increasingly fragmented as men work longer shifts with shorter rest periods. a pattern that serves commercial efficiency but places enormous stress on individual sailors. The hierarchy of merchant vessels, while less formal than naval service, still influences sleeping arrangements in significant ways. The captain enjoys private quarters that, while modest compared to naval standards, provide genuine comfort and privacy. Officers occupy smaller but still private cabins, while the crew shares the communal bunks of the forecastle. This arrangement reflects both practical necessities and the social structures that govern merchant shipping, where advancement depends more on skill and experience than on the formal rank. Structures of military service. The diverse nature of merchant cargoes creates unique challenges for maintaining healthy sleeping conditions. Ships carrying aromatic spices or volatile chemicals fill their quarters with odors that can make sleep impossible, while vessels transporting livestock create sanitation problems unknown on cargo-free naval vessels. The proximity of crew quarters to cargo holds means that merchant sailors must adapt to sleeping conditions that change with each voyage, developing flexibility and resilience that naval crews, with their more standardized accommodations, rarely need to master. Weather prediction becomes particularly crucial for merchant vessels because commercial schedules create pressure to maintain course even when conditions suggest prudence would dictate finding shelter. The economic losses associated with delayed cargo delivery mean that merchant captains often push their ships and crews into dangerous weather that naval commanders would avoid. This creates situations where normal sleeping arrangements become impossible just when rest becomes most essential for survival. The international character of merchant shipping exposes crews to weather patterns and ocean conditions that exceed the experience of any single national maritime tradition. A British merchant vessel might carry a crew that includes men with experience in Baltic storms, Mediterranean calms, Indian Ocean monsoons, and Atlantic hurricanes. This diversity of experience becomes an asset when extreme weather threatens. The ship, as different crew members contribute knowledge gained from different maritime environments. The transition from sail to steam during this period creates new challenges for merchant ship sleeping arrangements. Early steam vessels generate heat and noise that make traditional crew quarters uninhabitable, while the mechanical complexity of steam propulsion requires crew members with specialized skills, who command better accommodations than ordinary sailors. This technological transition, occurring throughout the middle decades of the 19th century, forces merchant shipping to develop new approaches to crew accommodation that balance the need for technical expertise with the constraints of commercial economics. The merchant marine also serves as a testing ground for innovations that eventually influence naval practice. Because commercial vessels operate with greater flexibility than military ships, merchant captains can experiment with different approaches to crew welfare and ship operation without the bureaucratic constraints that limit naval innovation. Successful modifications in merchant sleeping arrangements often find their way into naval practice as the value of improved crew comfort becomes apparent through actual operational experience as you observe the evening routine aboard this merchant vessel bound for Liverpool. You witness the complex interplay between commercial necessity, human welfare, and maritime tradition that characterizes merchant shipping. The men settling into their bunks represent a different breed of sailor from their naval counterparts, more individualistic, more diverse in background, and more accustomed to adapting to changing conditions. What they share is the eternal challenge of finding rest aboard vessels that never stop moving through waters that never stop threatening their survival. The American schooner Sally M. Steelman encounters the full fury of an Atlantic winter storm off Cape Hatteras in December 1877, beginning an ordeal that would test every aspect of merchant marine seamanship and human endurance. You observe the gradual transformation of a routine cargo voyage into a desperate struggle for survival as the ship is battered by forces that exceed both the vessel's design limitations and the crew's previous experience with extreme weather. The storm that strikes the Sally M. Steelman represents the kind of meteorological violence that makes the waters off Cape Hatteras among the most dangerous on Earth. The confluence of the warm Gulf Stream with cold Arctic air masses creates conditions where storms can intensify with stunning rapidity, generating winds and seas that can overwhelm even well-found vessels. For a merchant schooner caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, such conditions present challenges that go far beyond the normal hazards of commercial sailing, as the storm intensifies during the night hours of December 15th. The crew of the Sally M. Steelman faces the immediate problem of maintaining the ship's integrity, while dealing with sleeping arrangements that have become not just uncomfortable, but actively dangerous. The individual bunks that normally provide security and comfort in the forecastle become death traps as the ship begins to pitch and roll with extraordinary violence. Men attempting to rest find themselves thrown from their bunks with enough force to cause serious injury, while loose items become projectiles that threaten anyone who attempts to move about the cramped crew quarters. The commercial pressures that drove the schooner to maintain her schedule despite worsening weather conditions now exact their price as the crew discovers that their vessel lacks the structural strength and equipment. Redundancy of naval vessels designed for warfare, where a naval ship might carry multiple sets of sails, extensive repair materials, and crews trained specifically for damage control. The Sally M. Steelman operates with minimal equipment and a crew barely large enough to handle routine operations, let alone emergency repairs in extreme conditions. The breakdown of normal sleeping patterns begins almost immediately as the storm reaches its full intensity. The watch system that normally allows each crew member regular periods of rest collapses, as all hands are required to work continuously to keep the ship afloat. The forecastle bunks, so carefully constructed to provide individual sailors with private space, become inaccessible as the crew quarters flood with seawater that pours through every opening in the ship's hull. The merchant marine tradition of individual initiative and self-reliance, so different from the collective discipline of naval service, proves both an asset and a liability during extreme weather. Individual sailors draw on diverse backgrounds and experiences to improvise solutions to problems that exceed the ship's official procedures. But the lack of standardized emergency protocols means that coordinated action becomes difficult when clear leadership becomes essential. Sleep deprivation compounds every other challenge as the storm continues for days beyond what any previous experience had suggested was possible. Men who have not rested for 60 hours or more begin to exhibit the symptoms of extreme exhaustion, disorientation, hallucinations, and the kind of impaired judgment that can prove fatal when split-second decisions mean the difference between survival and disaster. The physical labor required to keep a damaged ship afloat would be demanding for well-rested men. For sailors operating on the edge of collapse, it represents an almost superhuman effort. The damaged condition of the schooner creates new challenges for finding any kind of rest as the vessel begins to take on water faster than the crew can pump it out. The crew quarters become uninhabitable, not just because of flooding, but because the rising water threatens the ship's stability in ways that make normal sleeping positions impossible. Men must remain constantly ready to move to different parts of the ship as flooding patterns change, making even brief periods of unconsciousness potentially fatal. The isolation that characterizes merchant vessels during this period means that the crew of the Sally M. Steelman cannot expect rescue or assistance from other ships. Unlike naval vessels, which typically operate as part of squadrons that can provide mutual support, merchant ships travel independently and must rely entirely on their own resources when disasters strike. This isolation places enormous psychological pressure on crews already pushed to their physical limits by the demands of survival. The duration of the ordeal, over a month of drifting and damaged condition, creates challenges that exceed anything in the normal experience of merchant sailors. The combination of inadequate food, contaminated water, exposure to extreme weather, and the complete absence of secure rest gradually reduces the crew to a primitive state of existence where basic survival takes precedence over all other considerations. The psychological effects of prolonged sleeplessness in life-threatening conditions begin to manifest themselves in ways that threaten the crew's ability to function as a coordinated unit. Men who have worked together for months or years begin to turn on each other as exhaustion and desperation erode the social bonds that normally maintain discipline and cooperation. The merchant marine tradition of egalitarian relationships among crew members proves inadequate when extreme stress reveals the darker aspects of human nature as the days stretch into weeks. The crew of the Sally M. Steelman confronts the reality that their survival depends not on seamanship or courage, but on pure endurance in conditions that push human beings beyond their natural limits. The comfortable bunks of the forecastle become a memory from a different world, replaced by whatever shelter can be improvised in a vessel that is slowly disintegrating around them. Sleep becomes not a matter of comfort or even basic health, but a luxury that must be balanced against the constant vigilance required to keep the ship afloat and watch for rescue that may never come. The eventual rescue of the survivors from the Sally M. Steelman after more than a month adrift reveals the hidden costs of commercial maritime operations that prioritize economic efficiency over crew welfare and vessel safety. You observe the gradual recognition within merchant shipping circles that the extreme conditions encountered in modern Atlantic commerce require fundamental changes in how commercial vessels are designed, equipped, and operated. The ordeal of the Sally M. Steelman represents just one example of a broader pattern of merchant marine disasters during the late 19th century. A period when competitive pressure and technological transition combined to create conditions where commercial vessels routinely operated beyond their safe limits. The human cost of this commercial efficiency becomes apparent through the testimony of survivors who describe weeks of existence where basic human needs sleep, food, water, shelter became impossible luxuries in the struggle for survival. The investigation into the disaster reveals systematic problems with merchant marine practices that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of a single storm. The practice of maintaining minimal crews to reduce labor costs means that commercial vessels lack the manpower reserves necessary to handle extended emergencies effectively. When normal watch rotations become impossible during extreme weather, merchant ships find themselves with exhausted crews attempting to perform complex and dangerous tasks, while operating in states of consciousness that border on delirium. The sleeping arrangements that serve adequately during normal voyages prove catastrophically inadequate. When extreme weather destroys the ship's structural integrity, the individual bunks that provide merchant sailors with greater comfort than naval hammocks become death traps when flooding and structural damage make the crew quarters uninhabitable. The personal possessions that merchant sailors are permitted to accumulate at privilege unknown in naval service become obstacles to evacuation and survival. When emergencies require rapid movement throughout the ship, the commercial pressure to maintain schedules regardless of weather conditions creates situations where merchant captains push their vessels into dangerous storms that naval commanders would avoid. The economic losses associated with delayed cargo delivery mean that commercial considerations override prudent seamanship, placing crews in situations where survival depends more on luck than skill. The Sally M. Steelman's encounter with the Cape Hatteras storm occurs precisely because commercial schedules do not accommodate weather delays. The testimony of survivors reveals the profound psychological effects of prolonged sleep deprivation. In life-threatening conditions, men who have not rested properly for weeks exhibit symptoms that include hallucinations, paranoid behavior, and the complete breakdown of normal social relationships. The merchant marine tradition of informal egalitarian crew relationships proves inadequate when extreme stress reveals the primitive survival instincts that civilization normally keeps suppressed. The rescue operations that eventually save some Survivors from merchant disasters like the Sally M. Steelman demonstrate both the heroism of individual rescuers and the systematic inadequacy of existing maritime safety procedures. The vast distances of Atlantic shipping routes mean that disabled vessels may drift for weeks before encountering other ships. While the lack of reliable communication systems makes coordinated rescue operations impossible. Survival depends largely on chance encounters with other vessels whose crews are willing to risk their own safety to attempt rescues. The medical treatment of survivors reveals the long-term effects of extreme deprivation on human beings pushed beyond their natural limits. Men who have survived weeks without adequate sleep, food, or water exhibit physical and psychological damage that in many cases proves permanent. The Merchant Marine. Unlike naval service with its medical officers and established procedures for treating casualties, lacks systematic approaches to caring for men who have endured extreme hardship. The economic analysis of merchant disasters reveals the false economy of operating vessels with minimal safety margins and crew accommodations. While reduced crew sizes and stripped-down equipment lower immediate operational costs, the losses associated with complete vessel destruction and crew casualties often exceed the savings achieved through corner cutting. Insurance companies begin to recognize these patterns and adjust their policies to encourage better safety practices among commercial operators. The technological transition from sail to steam during this period creates new challenges for merchant marine sleeping arrangements while potentially offering solutions to some traditional problems. Early steam vessels generate heat and noise that make traditional crew quarters uninhabitable. But mechanical propulsion also provides greater ability to avoid dangerous weather and maintain course toward rescue. The challenge becomes adapting crew accommodations to new technologies while maintaining the economic efficiency that commercial shipping demands. The international character of merchant shipping complicates efforts to improve safety standards. Because vessels operating under different national flags follow different regulations and practices, a disaster involving an American vessel may reveal problems that affect British, German, or Scandinavian ships operating in the same waters. But coordinating international responses to systematic safety issues proves difficult in an era of limited communication and competing national interests. Perhaps most significantly, the merchant marine disasters of the late 19th century begin to influence public opinion and government policy in ways that eventually lead to systematic improvements in maritime safety. The human stories of survival and loss resonate with populations increasingly connected to global commerce, creating political pressure for regulations that balance economic efficiency with basic human welfare. The suffering of individual sailors like those aboard the Sally M. Steelman becomes a catalyst for changes that will eventually make merchant marine service safer. If never entirely safe, the legacy of these disasters extends beyond immediate policy changes to influence the culture of merchant shipping itself. The recognition that extreme weather can push vessels and crews beyond their survival limits leads to gradual changes in practices, equipment, and crew training that acknowledge the fundamental reality that human beings have physical and psychological limits that cannot be exceeded without catastrophic consequences. You find yourself aboard HMS Dreadnought in 1906. Observing sleeping arrangements that would have been utterly foreign to sailors of the Great Storm of 1703, yet still recognizably descended from centuries of naval tradition. The hammock remains the foundation of enlisted accommodations. But everything else about naval sleep has been transformed by technological innovations that reflect both improved understanding of human physiology and the mechanical demands of twet. Modern warfare. The transition from wooden walls to steel hulls fundamentally alters the environment in which sailors attempt to rest. Steel ships conduct heat and cold far more efficiently than wooden vessels, creating sleeping quarters that can become unbearably hot in tropical waters or freezingly cold in northern latitudes. The solution requires mechanical ventilation systems that were unknown to earlier generations of sailors. Systems that create their own noise and mechanical disruption, but make life bearable in conditions that would have been impossible aboard. Wooden ships. The advent of steam power creates unprecedented challenges for naval sleeping. Arrangements as the heat generated by boilers and engines makes traditional crew quarters uninhabitable. Early steam warships attempt to maintain sailing ship accommodations while adding mechanical propulsion, creating hybrid vessels that satisfy neither the requirements of steam operation nor the comfort standards of traditional sailing ships. The result is a generation of vessels where crew comfort is sacrificed to mechanical necessity, leading to systematic problems with crew health and morale that influence naval architecture for decades. The mechanical complexity of steam-powered deep warships require specialized crew members whose skills command better accommodations than ordinary sailors receive. The engineers, stokers, and mechanics who keep the machinery running require rest periods that fit the demands of mechanical systems rather than traditional watch schedules, creating new categories of naval service with their own sleeping arrangements and rest patterns. This specialization begins the process that will eventually differentiate modern naval service from the universal seamanship that characterized sailing ship crews. Electric lighting transforms the daily rhythm of naval life in ways that profoundly affect sleep patterns, where sailors of earlier generations lived by natural light supplemented by candles and oil lamps. Modern naval crews work and rest in artificially illuminated spaces that can maintain activity around the clock. This technological capability creates operational advantages that come at the cost of disrupting the natural circadian rhythms that govern human sleep for millennia. The increased size and complexity of modern warships allows for innovations in crew accommodation that were impossible aboard smaller vessels. Separate compartments for different specialties, improved ventilation systems, and mechanical systems for heating and cooling create possibilities for crew comfort that exceed anything available to earlier naval generations. However, these improvements come with increased vulnerability to battle damage and mechanical failure that can make advanced accommodation systems liabilities during combat or emergencies. The development of wireless communication begins to affect naval sleep patterns as ships maintain continuous contact with shore authorities and other vessels. The watch-standing requirements for radio operators create new categories of essential personnel who must maintain alertness during specific hours, adding complexity to traditional watch systems and creating competition for rest periods among crew members with different but equally critical responsibilities. Modern naval weapons require crew members who can operate complex mechanical and electrical systems while maintaining the split-second timing that combat demands. This creates new pressures for adequate rest that go beyond traditional concerns about physical exhaustion. Recognizing that modern warfare requires mental acuity that cannot be maintained without proper sleep. The recognition of this requirement begins to influence naval policy in ways that prioritize crew rest as a matter of combat effectiveness rather than merely humanitarian concern. The increased speed of modern warships creates operational tempos that were impossible during the age of sail, allowing fleets to cover vast distances in time periods that would have required weeks or months for sailing vessels. This operational capability creates new pressures for continuous readiness that strain traditional approaches to watch standing and crew rest. Naval crews must maintain peak performance over extended periods while operating equipment that demands constant attention and expertise. The global reach of modern naval operations exposes crews to climatic conditions and operational demands that exceed the experience of any previous generation. Steam-powered warships can operate in Arctic ice, tropical heat, and open ocean conditions that would have been impossible for sailing vessels. But these expanded capabilities require crew accommodation systems that can maintain human comfort and effectiveness across environmental extremes that test the limits of technological solutions. The bureaucratization of modern naval service creates systematic approaches to crew welfare that replace the informal traditions of earlier generations. Official regulations govern everything from hammock spacing to ventilation requirements, reflecting both improved understanding of human needs and the complexity of modern naval operations. These regulations create standardized conditions that theoretically ensure adequate rest for all crew members, but they also introduce rigidity that can prove problematic when circumstances exceed the assumptions built into official policies. Modern naval medicine begins to recognize the connection between adequate rest and combat effectiveness in ways that influence ship design and operational procedures. The systematic study of crew health reveals patterns of illness and performance degradation that are directly related to sleeping conditions, leading to modifications in accommodation design and watch-standing policies. This scientific approach to crew welfare represents a fundamental departure from the tradition-based practices of earlier naval generations, introducing evidence-based decision-making that will eventually transform every aspect of naval life. As you observe the evening routine aboard HMS Dreadnought, you witness the culmination of 3 centuries of technological and social evolution in naval sleeping arrangements. The sailors settling into their hammocks benefit from innovations that their predecessors could not have imagined, yet they face challenges that are fundamentally similar to those confronted by their forebears. How to find adequate rest aboard vessels designed for warfare in an environment that never stops, threatening human survival. The outbreak of the Great War in 1914 subjects naval sleeping arrangements to stresses that exceed anything in previous maritime experience, as the scale and intensity of industrial warfare push both technology and human endurance to their absolute limits. You observe the gradual breakdown of peacetime routines and accommodations as naval crews discover that modern warfare creates demands for continuous alertness that cannot be sustained through traditional approaches to rest and watch standing. The submarine threat transforms every aspect of naval life, creating conditions where normal sleep becomes not just difficult but potentially fatal for crews, who must maintain constant vigilance against underwater attack. The requirement for continuous anti-submarine watches means that traditional watch systems prove inadequate. When extended operations require crews to maintain peak alertness for weeks at a time while operating in waters where momentary inattention can result in catastrophic slash-by torpedo attacks. The Battle of Jutland in 1916 demonstrates how the intensity of modern naval combat creates sleep deprivation patterns that exceed the experience of any previous generation of sailors. The preliminary maneuvering, the actual engagement, and the aftermath require crews to remain at action stations for periods that stretch human endurance beyond its normal limits. Men who have not slept properly for days must operate complex gunnery and engineering systems, while making split-second decisions that determine not just their own survival, but the outcome of the largest naval battle in human history. The convoy system developed to protect merchant shipping creates new patterns of naval operations that strain existing approaches to crew rest. Escort vessels must maintain station for weeks at a time while shepherding slow-moving merchant convoys across Atlantic waters infested with German submarines. The requirement for constant vigilance, combined with the irregular schedules imposed by convoy operations, creates conditions where normal watch rotations become impossible, and crews must find ways to rest while remaining instantly ready for combat. The introduction of aircraft operations aboard naval vessels creates new categories of personnel with specialized sleep requirements that differ from traditional naval watch standing. Pilots require specific periods of uninterrupted rest before flying operations, while the crews responsible for aircraft maintenance and deck operations must coordinate their sleep schedules with flight activities that depend on weather conditions and tactical circumstances rather than traditional naval routine. The industrial scale of Great War naval operations require supply systems and support activities that operate continuously. Creating shore-based naval installations where thousands of personnel work around the clock to maintain fleet operations. These installations develop new approaches to shift work and crew rest that influence shipboard practices. Introducing systematic scheduling methods that attempt to optimize human performance through scientific management of sleep and duty cycles. The medical services of modern navies begin to document the systematic effects of sleep deprivation on combat effectiveness, leading to the first scientific studies of how exhaustion affects everything from marksmanship to engineering performance. These studies reveal patterns of degraded performance that extend far beyond simple fatigue, demonstrating that sleep-deprived crews make increasingly dangerous errors in judgment that can prove catastrophic during combat operations. The psychological stresses of modern warfare compound the physical challenges of maintaining adequate rest aboard vessels designed for maximum combat effectiveness rather than crew comfort. The knowledge that enemy submarines can attack without warning creates constant psychological tension that makes normal sleep impossible, even when duty schedules theoretically provide adequate rest periods. Crews develop chronic insomnia patterns that persist long after immediate combat threats have passed. The global scale of naval operations during the Great War exposes crews to operational demands that require continuous readiness across time zones and climatic conditions that test the limits of human adaptation. Naval vessels operating in Arctic convoys, Mediterranean patrols, and Pacific stations must maintain combat readiness while dealing with environmental conditions that make traditional sleeping arrangements inadequate or impossible. The technological complexity of Great War naval vessels creates maintenance requirements that cannot be deferred during combat operations, forcing crews to balance combat readiness with the technical demands of keeping complex mechanical and electrical systems operational. This creates competition for personnel time that often results in maintenance. Crews working continuously while fighting crews attempt to maintain normal watch schedules, leading to systematic patterns of exhaustion that affect entire vessels. The use of poison gas in land warfare creates concerns about chemical attacks on naval vessels, leading to modifications in ventilation systems and emergency procedures that affect sleeping quarters and rest patterns. Crews must be trained to respond instantly to gas attacks while maintaining the sealed conditions necessary for protection, creating new categories of emergency drill that disrupt normal sleep schedules and add psychological stress to already demanding operational requirements. The unprecedented duration of the Great War tests human endurance in ways that reveal the fundamental limits of traditional naval practices. Crews who had expected to serve for months find themselves engaged in operations that extend for years, creating cumulative patterns of exhaustion and stress that cannot be addressed through existing policies and procedures. The result is a systematic breakdown of peacetime standards and the development of emergency approaches to crew management that sacrifice long-term health and welfare to immediate operational necessity. The aftermath of the Great War catalyzes a fundamental reconsideration of naval sleeping arrangements as medical science begins to provide systematic understanding of how sleep deprivation affects human performance and health. You observe the gradual transformation of naval policy as traditional practices based on centuries of experience give way to evidence-based approaches that apply scientific knowledge to the ancient problem of providing adequate rest for crews operating in hostile environments. The development of systematic sleep research during the interwar period provides navies with unprecedented understanding of how human sleep cycles affect everything from reaction times to decision-making capabilities. This scientific knowledge reveals that traditional naval practices, while evolved through practical experience, often conflict with optimal human performance patterns. The challenge becomes adapting naval operations to human biological requirements without compromising the operational effectiveness that naval service demands. The introduction of air conditioning and mechanical ventilation systems transforms the physical environment in which naval crews attempt to rest, creating possibilities for climate control that were impossible aboard earlier vessels. These technological capabilities allow naval architects to design sleeping quarters that maintain comfortable temperatures and air quality regardless of external conditions. But they also create dependencies on mechanical systems that can fail. During combat or emergencies, modern naval architecture begins to incorporate specific design features intended to optimize crew rest, including improved noise insulation, vibration dampening, and lighting systems that can be adjusted to support natural sleep cycles. These modifications represent the first systematic attempt to design warships around human biological requirements rather than forcing human beings to adapt to whatever conditions mechanical and combat requirements happen to create. The development of shift work systems in industrial settings provides models for naval watchstanding that attempt to optimize human performance while maintaining continuous operational capability. These systems, based on scientific understanding of circadian rhythms and sleep cycles, offer alternatives to traditional naval watches that may provide better crew rest without compromising operational readiness. The increasing complexity of modern naval weapon systems creates requirements for crew alertness and technical competence that cannot be maintained without adequate rest. The operation of radar systems, sonar equipment, and electronic warfare devices demands sustained concentration and split-second decision-making that deteriorates rapidly when operators are sleep-deprived. This creates operational imperatives for crew rest that go beyond humanitarian concerns to encompass basic combat effectiveness. Modern naval medicine develops systematic approaches to treating the sleep disorders and chronic fatigue that result from extended naval service, recognizing these conditions as occupational hazards that require medical intervention rather than disciplinary action. This medical understanding begins to influence naval policy in ways that prioritize crew health as an essential component of operational readiness rather than a luxury that can be sacrificed to immediate operational demands. The psychological dimensions of naval service receive increasing attention as medical professionals recognize that mental health problems often manifest as sleep disturbances that affect entire crews. The development of systematic approaches to military psychology provides tools for addressing the cumulative stress of naval service in ways that can prevent the breakdown of crew effectiveness during extended operations. The advent of global communication systems creates new requirements for continuous watchstanding that strain traditional approaches to crew scheduling. Naval vessels that maintain constant contact with shore commands and other units must provide communications personnel around the clock, creating specialized watch requirements that compete with other duties for limited personnel resources. The development of nuclear propulsion creates both opportunities and challenges for naval sleeping arrangements as vessels gain the capability for extended submerged operations that eliminate the natural light cycles that help regulate human sleep patterns. Nuclear submarines require crew accommodation systems that can maintain healthy sleep cycles for months at a time without external environmental cues, leading to innovations in artificial lighting and climate control that influence surface ship design as well. Modern naval training systems begin to incorporate specific instruction in sleep, hygiene, and fatigue management, recognizing that crew effectiveness depends as much on proper rest as on technical competence and seamanship skills. This training represents a fundamental departure from traditional naval practices that assumed crew members would naturally adapt to whatever sleeping conditions their duties imposed. The computerization of naval systems creates new possibilities for automated watchstanding that can reduce crew workload and provide more opportunities for adequate rest. However, these systems also create new vulnerabilities to mechanical failure and cyber attack that require human backup systems and specialized technical personnel with their own rest requirements. The modern understanding of sleep as a biological necessity rather than a luxury fundamentally transforms naval policy and ship design in ways that recognize human welfare as an essential component of operational effectiveness. This transformation represents the culmination of centuries of evolution in naval practice, bringing scientific understanding to bear on problems that have challenged naval crews since the first warships put to sea. As you observe a modern naval crews settling into climate-controlled berthing compartments equipped with individual bunks, reading lights, and entertainment systems that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations of sailors, you witness the resolution of many traditional challenges combined with the emergence of new problems that reflect the complexity of modern naval operations. The eternal struggle to provide adequate rest for crews operating in hostile environments continues, but it now benefits from scientific understanding and technological capabilities that offer genuine solutions to problems that once seemed insurmountable. Across these 3 centuries of maritime evolution, the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. How do human beings find rest and recovery while operating vessels designed for warfare in an environment that never stops threatening their survival? The canvas hammocks of 1703, the individual bunks of merchant sailors, the climate-controlled berthing of modern warship siege represents humanity's attempt to solve the same basic problem using the technology and understanding available to each generation. The stories of sailors seeking sleep during storms reveal something profound about human adaptation and resilience. Whether facing the great storm of 1703, Pacific typhoons, or the industrial warfare of the 20th century, sailors have consistently found ways to endure conditions that push human endurance beyond its apparent limits. Their experiences remind us that comfort and security, things we take for granted, are actually remarkable human achievements that require constant maintenance and innovation to preserve. Perhaps most significantly, these accounts demonstrate how technological progress, while solving some problems, consistently creates new challenges that require fresh solutions. The hammock system that served sailing navies for centuries became inadequate for steam-powered vessels. The individual bunks that provided merchant sailors with greater comfort created new vulnerabilities during extreme weather. The sophisticated environmental systems of modern ships offer unprecedented crew comfort while creating dependencies on technology that can fail at presay. At critical moments, the boring details of naval sleeping arrangements, the precise measurements of hammock spacing, the regulatory specifications for bedding allowances, the mechanical requirements of ventilation systems prove to be anything but boring. When examined in the context of human survival, these mundane administrative details represent the accumulated wisdom of generations of sailors who learned through bitter experience what works and what fails when human beings are pushed to their absolute limits. In the end, these stories of sleeping sailors remind us that behind every great historical event, every naval battle, every voyage of exploration, stand individual human beings who face the same basic challenges we all confront: the need for rest, security, and the simple comfort of a safe place to sleep. Their solutions to these eternal problems evolve through centuries of trial and error, continue to influence how we think about human welfare in extreme environments today.